So I'm going to talk about soil testing, and this applies to any farming, not just pastures. I just want to start off, how many of you have taken soil tests? And no judgment if you haven't. Okay, that's great. So what we're going to cover today is why you should soil test, and if you already have, then you know why you're doing it. The types of tests that you can take and what's on the test. Then we'll talk about how to soil test, reading a soil test, and getting recommendations from your agronomist or people that you know, or from the soil test lab themselves, and a little bit about ongoing pasture management, because I want to say soil testing is not the only thing that matters. There's other types of tests, and management is probably even more important. So why do you want to soil test? Well, what are the main things you want from your pasture? You want good yield, and you want good quality forage or hay. And a soil test, the nutrition of your soil impacts the quality of your hay or forage, which is somewhat obvious, but it's good to know what's going on in the soil. And then a little bit about mindset. So soil health has really become a part of the forefront of the agriculture industry. It continues to grow, and it might be something that you want to be conscious of. Your resources, so time and cost, these are the most non-renewable resources, and I know that you want to save time and money. And then a little bit, you want to think about your management style. Do you want to be proactive or reactive? It's okay to be either. If you're proactive, you're looking at your soil regardless of how well it's doing, because you want to know where it's at. You might be reactive if you see a problem area in your pasture or something that's not performing well and you want to know what's going on, so you can take a soil test for that. And I took this picture from Google, but don't guess soil tests. That's a really common thing. You don't know what's going on until you actually test it at a lab. So just to get a little more into it, the yield, quality, and nutrition. This is one of the most basic first steps to accomplishing, or soil testing is one of the most basic first steps to seeing about yield, quality, and nutrition. pH, you want to get a baseline of this, and this is the measure of acidity or basicness of your soil. If you've ever heard the term sweetening your soil, that's liming, and a lot of farmers have to do that out here because we just naturally have a more acid soil. The problem with a really acid soil is certain nutrients like calcium are less available, and other nutrients like aluminum may be toxic to your plants at a low pH. And then the nutrient balance. So your soil test is giving you your phosphorus and potassium levels. You want to know what's in there because that's what your plants need to grow. And then again, this is just one facet. Of course, proper sunlight, grazing and weed management are really crucial, selecting the right species. And then if you want to go more full picture, you can do tissue plant analysis or sap analysis to see what your plants are actually taking up from the soil, because sometimes that can be different. So it's good to know that. So just to go into the soil health, I think, so conventional fertilizers tend to be higher in salt. And if you have, based on your soil test, a lot of salt in your soil, you want to avoid that. So there are lower salt content fertilizers. They tend to be more expensive. So knowing that you might need to go that route is important. And if you have enough nutrients in your soil and you don't need to apply that fertilizer, you don't need to add that extra salt. Nutrients imbalance, this is impacted by your soil test because then you can try to balance it out after you see your results. And then erosion, compaction, and water infiltration, those are more indirectly affected because if you look at the organic matter, which all improve water infiltration, you have less compaction, and things like that. And then I liked this principles of soil health. I don't need to go too far into it, but as a pasture grower, you basically follow the minimizing disturbance, maximizing your living roots because you want grass to be growing, maximizing soil cover, same thing, and maximizing biodiversity. So especially if you have animals, you're really maximizing that biodiversity, and you might have different species of grass or legumes. So you're already winning if you're growing pasture. And then saving resources. You don't want to waste your dollars on unnecessary expenses. I think this goes without saying. And you want to maximize your efficiency, applying the right rate at the right time. And this graph is from USDA. It shows the spikes in fertilizer costs. 2008 is that first spike that you see, and then again in 2020. The costs are not going down, or they're going down compared to the spike, but if you look at pre-spike levels, they're not going to go down that far. So I know it's important to save money, and so soil testing can do that. So when you look at a soil test, most typically you look at the fertility, which is a chemical test, and we do not do this at Skagit Farmers, which is where I work. We send it out to a lab, and I can give lab recommendations later. But the main, most basic parameter is pH. This will tell you your lime requirement. And then CEC, this is cation exchange capacity. It sounds complicated, but it's really just the ability of the soil to hang on to nutrients. So if you have a really sandy soil, you'll have a lower CEC. This is because there's not as many exchange sites in your soil to hang on to nutrients. And if you have a really high clay soil, there's a lot more surface area, a lot more exchange sites, and they will hang on to nutrients almost too much sometimes to where you need excess for plant availability. So if you're applying fertilizer to a really sandy soil, you don't want to dump on too much at once. You want to do multiple applications of a lower amount because it can't hang on to the fertilizer, it'll just seep out through the profile or erode off, so you're wasting fertilizer. Then available nutrients, it's a chemical test in the lab. I will say for phosphorus, they test in the lab at a certain warmer temperature than what we might experience here in the Pacific Northwest in the early spring. So your phosphorus availability depends on warming temperatures because your microbes are starting to come alive and start to work through the soil and release those nutrients. And if it's really cool out, they're still relatively tied up. So sometimes you want to add phosphorus in the early spring. And then total digestion. This isn't super commonly done, but it is an interesting test to look at. You could just do it one time. It looks at the total number of nutrients in the soil profile, and this gives you an idea of not what's available to the plant, but what you have. So you could have hundreds of pounds of phosphorus and potassium in your soil profile, but they're just not being released. They're locked up. And then soil quality and biology. We don't do this Solvita test very often, but it's interesting and you could look at it if you wanted to. It's a measure of carbon dioxide release. And in that picture at the bottom right-hand corner, it kind of shows this. If you have a lot more microbial activity, you're gonna have more CO2 releasing, and this indicates that they are gonna release nitrogen to your plants. If you have very low CO2, there's not a lot of microbial activity, and you might have not as much nitrogen released. And this is interesting to look at how much you might want to apply. So organic matter is sort of along these lines too. You could have a really slow releasing organic matter or really fast turnover of organic matter. And this Solvita test gives you an indicator of which one that is. Our soil tests just give you a organic matter percentage, but you don't know how fast or slow releasing it is. And then just quickly on how to soil test. This might be, everyone might already know this, but if you want to look at the representative area of your field. So in this picture, I don't know how well you can see it, but somebody sort of graphed out the field and put dots along each area. So you want to take sub-samples, and you can either use a soil probe or a sharp spade and try to get 6 to 10 inches, 6 to 8 if you can. And you take little sub-samples from each parts of those fields, and then you mix it together in a 5-gallon bucket as thoroughly as possible, and you just put that sample into part of the sample, because you're not going to send the whole thing, but a part of it into a bag or a box and ship it out. You don't want to put in a really unproductive or bad area in the same sample as the representative part, because it'll skew it. It'll skew it towards a worse or lesser nutrients potentially. It's also interesting to compare the two, so you could send in 2 separate tests. And then it's very important to send at the same lab every time you send out a soil test, because they use different methods, and so it'll just be more accurate that way. And as pasture people, I would say you could just do it every 2 or 3 years. You can do it every year if you would like to. It's just however you want to do it. Oh, and then spring or fall is a typical timing. So this is Soil Test Farm Consultants. They're typically who we send our soil tests to, but there are many other labs around here that are great. I just wanted to show you what it might look like when you get your results back. It might be hard to read. It is hard to read, so we're not going to go into it too deeply, but on the top right hand, there's pH, so that's the first thing I look at. You see the pH, it tells you your recommended lime application amount, which is pretty nice. And on the left-hand side, it just gives you your nutrients in parts per million. And this is where, at the bottom, the graph is super helpful. It interprets those results for you and says, okay, if you're growing pasture and you're continuing to grow pasture, this is how much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, and boron you should apply. And it also gives you your organic matter content, which is interesting to look at over time, especially as you continue to farm. You hope that number is staying the same or even going up if possible. And then your cation exchange capacity is what I mentioned before. So it kind of gives you an idea of the type of soil you have. And then the base saturation has to do with CEC as well. And sorry, it's hard to read, but that ideal cation balance gives you the percentage of where you want your potassium and calcium to be. In this soil, calcium is only at 46%, and you would like to see that around, I like to see it around 70 or 80%. And calcium, just so you know, if you have a ton of magnesium, that's an indicator that your soil is tightly held together. With calcium, you might have a looser, fluffier soil. And here's another soil test. This is simply soil testing. I don't want to leave out any other labs, but these are just the 2 that I had. This is more geared towards organic growers, and it's a nice, simple test. It shows in a nice, simple way interpreting your results. So if you're low, medium, high, or very high, in the low or medium area, you probably want to add fertilizer. In the high or very high, you don't need to add any. It also gives you that lime recommendation and the pH. And then it gives you organic fertilizer amounts, which I think is really helpful. This test does it per 1,000 square feet, but if you multiply that by 43.5, that gives you per acre. And we can also help you with this if you have any questions. And so then you took your soil test, you got your results, and you have your recommendations. So you want to fertilize based on those recommendations. Apply the nitrogen in the springtime. So early spring, this is pasture, but I think any crops apply to this as well. If possible, split your nitrogen applications. And then phosphorus and potassium, that's P and K. They're typically needed in smaller amounts, and based on your soil test, you might not need them at all. If you're trying to grow legumes in your pasture, boron, which is just chronically deficient in Pacific Northwest soils because we have so much rain, you might want to apply boron. And the nice thing about boron is it does a lot for plants, but you just need a very small amount. If you put too much on, it can cause toxicity, so you want to be careful about that, but it's relatively cheap to apply, and it's a micronutrient, and we're learning more and more how important micronutrients are. And then this is just a graph that I could send out to anyone, or they might have it at the conservation district. You should apply the right species based on your drainage class of your soil. And just like if it's well drained or really poorly drained, which you can tell in the winter if you have giant ponds out there in your fields. And you should apply the right species, otherwise you're just wasting your dollars on seed. I will say, Whatcom Conservation District has a new drill where you can rent it out and drill in seed, and this gives you such a better chance of good, proper seed to soil contact, and you're also saving money on that seed because you can reduce your rate of seeding versus broadcasting, where you're just applying it to the surface. And I also like that because you could spread fertilizer. You can rent a spreader with us, or Whatcom might have other resources for you, but if you spread it separately, that'll prevent salt contact with the seed, which helps as well. And then, of course, never graze or mow below 3 inches, and use your own observations. These are just a general idea of costs. Fertility can cost $100 to $300 an acre, and that's conventional, so organic is 25 cents a pound, and you could likely need 1 ton per acre, so that's like $500. Lime for us is 25 cents a pound, but you might find it cheaper, or you could use someone like Northwest Lime who can apply it and try to save costs there. Seeding costs are $100 to $175. Unless you are drilling, it might be less, and overseeding would be less. That's where you're just adding seed to an existing pasture. So in summary, make sure to soil test to know where your pasture stands. Use this knowledge to make management decisions and plan for the time and cost. It's okay to improve it over several years. You don't need to do it all in 1 year. And costs could go down, so that could be a good way to go. Continue to test every 2 to 3 years, and if you're trying to make changes and you want to look at it every year, they're not very expensive, so you might want to do it every year. And then most importantly, use your own observations. You might have your lab test saying one thing, but you're seeing something else out in the field, and you're probably right, and you know your farm and what's actually happening, so just pay attention to that. And this is a book I just wanted to put up there, The Biological Farmer. It's really good. It's an older book by Gary Zimmer. He's at the forefront of regenerative agriculture, but he goes into really practical use information about managing a pasture. He was a dairy farmer, but he'll go over soil tests and then explain to you what you should do based on them. And he also talks about how soil test is not the only thing that matters, and it's very true, but it's a really good baseline, and it's important to do. So I definitely recommend that book. So thank you. My email's up there if you have any questions. We also have some other agronomists here from Skagit Farmers out there. Blake Carson is out there, and a few others possibly. So thank you, and feel free to reach out with further questions. And yep, have a good day.
We do have some time for questions now that you might have for Molly. All right, I'm coming over.
How much do soil tests cost?
So they just raised costs, of course, at soil test. I think it's $70 per test. I'm not sure about simply soil testing, but I'm guessing it's within that range. Although that is for testing every nutrient, and in pasture, I don't think you need to test all of the micronutrients, so you could probably get away with a $50 test. I think that Solvita test is like $30. That measures the carbon dioxide.
And I will say that Whatcom Conservation District offers one free soil test if you are raising animals on pasture or are looking to put manure or fertilizer on pasture. So that is one resource. Our booth is the first one right at the greeter. So check in there, and we do provide that one free soil test, as well as we rent now a manure spreader. We mentioned that earlier. And we also have that no-till seed drill that we just started renting as well. So talk to us. We're at that first booth right by the greeter tent for more info on that. Any other questions for Molly while we have her on stage? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Molly. And you can visit her at the Skagit Farmers booth.